Hey everybody, how you doing? This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. We're reading Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. This is an essay. It's a book, but it's an essay. It's translated by Luigi Ricci. We're on part 4. Hopefully you read the first 3 parts with me. And remember, we're going to have a comprehensive analysis of this just marvelous book on this, on the study of power. Ready? All right. Chapter 9. This is part 4, but we're whipping through chapters. Chapter 9 of the civic principality. So he's going to talk about the different types of kingdoms and principalities. But we now come to the case where a citizen becomes a prince. Remember who he's writing this to, ladies and gentlemen? He's writing this to Lorenzo the Magnificent. He wants to give Lorenzo the benefit of his advice. He has nothing else to give a prince. No horses, no riches. So he's going to give him the benefit of his study of human beings, mainly of princes and how they gain, retain, and lose power. So always keep that in mind, and keep in mind these little arrows that talk about the things you should write down, because those are going to be part of our review and the analysis. And here we go. But we now come to the case where a citizen becomes a prince, not through crime or intolerable violence, as we've seen, but by the favor of his fellow citizens, which may be called a civic principality. To attain this position depends not entirely on worth or entirely on fortune. Remember, he talks about fortune a lot, keep in mind, but rather on the cunning assisted by fortune. On cunning assisted by fortune. One attains it by help of popular favor or by the favor of the aristocracy. Pardon me. For in every city, these two opposite parties are to be found. What two opposite parties are those? The aristocracy, right, and the citizens, arising from the desire of the populace to avoid the oppression of the great, and the desire of the great to command and oppress the people. So I put a little arrow there, make sure you remember that. That's what he's saying happens with the popular and the aristocracy, right? And from these two opposing interests, why are they opposing, ladies and gentlemen? Because the desire to command and oppress people and the desire of the people to avoid oppression. So you've got kind of an approach avoidance conflicts going on. And from these two opposing interests arises in the city one of 3 effects. Look how logical Machiavelli is and how he's trying to help Lorenzo understand his position as a prince. Either absolute government, liberty, or license. The former is created either by the populace or the nobility, the absolute government, depending on the relative opportunities of the two parties. For when the nobility see that they are unable to resist the people, they unite in exalting one of their number and creating him a prince. Make sure you understand that. So he's saying when nobility sees that they can't control the people, they get together and they create themselves a prince, so as to be able to carry out their own designs under the shadow of his authority. You understand that? So they appoint a figurehead. Let's call him a figurehead, right? But they're really calling the shots. Do you know any situation like that in modern times where they elected somebody, the nobility, sometimes referred to as elite, right? They get somebody, they put them out there, and they're trying to control the populace from the background, the shadow of his authority, the prince's authority that they did. The populace, second one here, on the other hand, when unable to resist the nobility, so the people, endeavor to exalt and create a prince in order to be protected by his authority. So the people You know anything like that going on? So the people, when unable to resist the nobility, the elite, they endeavor to exalt and create a prince in order to be protected by his authority. He who becomes prince by help of the nobility has greater difficulty in maintaining his power than he who is raised by the populace. I want you to pay attention to this, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, he wrote this quite a while ago, and I'm telling you right now, as I read this to you and with you and for you, I'm seeing a lot of what's going on in what he said then going on now, if you know what I mean. For he is surrounded by those who think themselves his equals. So he who becomes a prince with the help of nobility isn't, and not his difficulty in maintaining his power more than someone raised by the populace. For he is surrounded by those who think themselves his equals, and is thus unable to direct or command as he pleases. I don't know what to tell you. I'm stunned. But one who is raised to leadership by popular favor finds himself alone and has no one or very few who are not ready to obey him. Besides which, it is impossible to satisfy the nobility by fair dealing and without inflicting injury on others. Whereas, it is very easy to satisfy the mass of people in this way, for the aim of the people is more honest than that of the nobility. I don't know. You believe that? I kind of believe that. The latter desiring to oppress, the nobility desiring to oppress, and the former merely to avoid oppression. It must be added that the prince can never insure himself against a hostile populace on account of their number, but he can against the hostility of the great, as they are but a few. Again, ladies and gentlemen, this is insight. Look at all these arrows. The worst that a prince has to expect from a hostile people is to be abandoned. But from the hostile nobles, he has to fear not only desertion, but their active opposition. And as they are far more seeing and more cunning, they are always in time to save themselves and take sides with the one who they expect will conquer. The prince is moreover obliged to live always with the same people, but he can easily do so without the same nobility, being able to make and unmake them at any time and improve their position and deprive them of it as he pleases. And to throw a further light on this part of my argument, remember he's talking to Lorenzo the Magnificent, not us. We're just benefiting from listening. I would say that nobles are to be considered in two different manners. That is, they are either to be ruled so as to make them entirely dependent on your fortunes, he's talking to the prince, or else not. Those that are thus bound to you are not as rapacious, aggressively greedy. They must be honored and loved. And those who stand aloof must be considered in two ways. That they're either doing this, standing aloof, through pusillanimity, lack of courage, timidity, right? They're scared and natural want of courage. And in this case, you ought to just make use of them, and especially such as are of good counsel. They've got good counsel, so as they may honor you in posterity and in adversity, you have nothing to fear of them. But when they are not bound to you of a set purpose and for ambitious ends, it's a sign that they think more of themselves than of you. And from such men, the prince must guard himself and look upon them as secret enemies who will help to ruin him when in adversity. And remember, adversity strikes every now and then. One, however, who becomes a prince by favor of the populace, now we're switching to the other ones, must maintain the populace's friendship, which he will find very easy because the people asking nothing more but not to be oppressed. But one who against the people's wishes becomes the prince by favor of the nobles should above all endeavor to gain the favor of the people, and this will be easy for him if he protects them. And as men who receive good from whom they expected evil, they feel a greater obligation to their benefactor. So the populace will soon become even better disposed toward him than if he had become the prince through their favor. The prince can win their favor in many ways, which vary according to circumstances, for which no certain rule can be given and will therefore be passed over. I can't find a rule that does that, so I'm going to pass over this. I will only say, in conclusion, that it's necessary for a prince to possess the friendship of the people. Otherwise, he has no recourse in times of adversity. I put a footnote up here. Nabis is a polarizing figure in history. To some, he was a reformer, sought to restore Spartan greatness. To others, he was a ruthless tyrant. Isn't that the truth? People see people differently, don't they? Whose self-serving policies hasten Sparta's decline. You see the E.G.? I give you E.G. period when Machiavelli uses examples, and in this case, he's using the example of Nabis. Now, a lot of these people you have never heard of. Before I read The Prince, I had never heard of them. But as you read The Prince, and this is the benefit of classical literature expands your mind. It expands what you think about. Remember, the more you can think about, the more free you are. If you can't think about Nabis, for example, if you never heard of him, you can't think about him. But now, because you're reading with Jimmy, you're going to hear about him, and maybe you go and read about him. Maybe you read about him. Nabis was the prince of Spartans, and he sustained a siege by the whole of Greece and a victorious Roman army and defended his country against them and maintained his own position. Remember what he told us earlier, or he's going to tell us, that what a prince should really spend his time on, is the study of war. We're going to talk about that. So he uses these examples because Spartans were great fighters. It sufficed when the danger arose for him to make sure of a few, which would not have sufficed if the populace had been hostile to him. And let no one oppose my opinion in this by quoting a trite proverb. He who builds on the people builds on mud. He calls this proverb, a proverb is like a saying, a wise saying, and he calls it trite. That's an adjective modifying the word proverb. So he calls this proverb, he who builds on people builds on mud. He disagrees with that completely because he's saying you need the people. You got to have the friendship of the people to rule. Very important. Because that is true when a private citizen relies upon the people and persuades himself that they will liberate him if he is opposed by enemies or by magistrates. In this case, he might often find himself deceived, as were in Rome the Gracchi and in Florence Messer Giorgio Scali. Those two obviously were deceived. So he's not saying it's not true. He's saying it's trite because you need the love of the people. But sometimes if you think, right, people rely, if a private citizen relies on the people once he becomes the prince and persuades himself they're going to help him in times of adversity, he's fooling himself. But when it is a prince who founds himself on this basis, one who can command and is a man of courage and does not get frightened in adversity. These are very important characteristics, Machiavelli is saying, for the prince. and does not neglect other preparations, and one who by his own valor and measures animates the mass of the people, he will not find himself deceived by them, and he will find that he has laid his foundations well. Usually, these principalities are in danger when the prince from the position of a civic ruler changes to an absolute ruler. For these princes either command themselves or by means of magistrates. In the latter case, their position is weaker and more dangerous, for they are at the mercy of those citizens who are appointed magistrates. Remember, he's studying power, and he's saying that in this case, when he appoints magistrates, he's weaker, who can especially in times of adversity and with great facility, deprive them of their position, either by acting against them or by not obeying them. The prince is not in time in such dangers to assume absolute authority, for the citizens and subjects who are accustomed to take their orders from the magistrates are not ready in these emergencies to obey the princes. And he will always, in difficult times, lack men whom he can rely on. So one of the rules of the prince is you got to surround yourself with people you can rely on. Such a prince cannot base himself on what he sees in quiet times, when the citizens have need of the state, for then everyone is full of promises, and each one is ready to die for the prince when death is far off. When the enemy is not here, please allow me. There's an earlier movie of Robin Hood, the first one with Errol Flynn, where you can see this in action. When the sheriff of Nottingham is talking to the knights about the dangers of Robin Hood, and one of these knights is a blowhard, and he's, I'll take care of him, because he's nowhere near, right? But in adversity, when the state has need of citizens, then the prince will find but few. And this experience is the more dangerous in that it can only be had once. You understand this? Therefore, a wise prince will seek means by which his subjects will always, and in every possible condition of things, have need of his government, and then they will always be faithful to him. There's a great movie with Gary Cooper called High Noon. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to see it, because High Noon is a movie about this sentence right here. In adversity, when the state, because High Noon, Gary Cooper was the sheriff, has need of citizens, there's 3 killers coming back from prison to kill Gary Cooper. He finds out he will find that he has few people standing with him. He goes through the whole town asking people to help him when these 3 killers are coming back. He has just gotten married, and he's going to be leaving town. I think Grace Kelly, the wonderful actress, was his wife, and he was going to leave town, but these 3 killers are coming back, and he feels he has a responsibility and a duty. So he goes throughout the town asking for help. Now, that's not just in the movies, ladies and gentlemen. That's not just in the movies. Jimmy was fired once, well, 3 times, but second time he was fired, there was an ad that appeared in the newspaper for his job, and he went back and he confronted the the office manager. Her name was Lee, wonderful character, with the 2 other people in his department, and said, "We demand to know who this is. Who are they advertising to replace?" And we finally got out of Lee that it was me. And the reason they wanted to fire me was because I wasn't, quote, heavy enough. And I said, well, I'll gain some weight. I don't know if she got the joke. In any case, she said, Phil, the executive vice president, said you could stay as long as you need. I said, okay, thanks. And I went around to all the account managers. I had been working there for 1.5 years, just performing splendidly. Seriously, I'm not just blowing smoke. So I went around to the 6 account guys that ran, this was a trade show company that ran trade shows, very successful. And I went to the 6 account guys that ran those trade shows with a petition, and I asked them to sign this petition to keep me. That Phil was trying to fire me, and I was wondering if you'd sign this petition to keep me. You know the good work I've done for you, blah, blah, blah. Increased attendance at your trade show, blah, blah, blah. Ladies and gentlemen, not one of them would sign that petition. I had one guy who was just one of the nicest guys that I ever met. He started crying when I showed him this petition and explained the situation. And he started crying in front of me, and he said, "I'd like to, Jimmy, but I have a family. I really like to, but I have a family." So no one would sign the petition, and I got fired, but I left on my own terms because before I made that move, I had already learned from being fired the first time, you don't make a move on anybody unless you have a job in your back pocket, and I already had a job offer when I made that move to ask for more money, and that's why they placed the ad in the newspaper to replace me, because I was demanding something that wasn't my due. Of course it was my due. In any case, the study of power is what Machiavelli's all about, and unless you understand that, you're liable to get cut off at the knees and not even know it. Before you know it, you're cut off at the knees, and you don't even know why crap happens to you. So pay attention. It's important. Chapter 10. How the strength of all states should be measured. In examining the character of these principalities, it is necessary to consider another point, namely, whether the prince has such a position as to be able, in the case of need, to maintain himself alone, or whether he has always the need of the protection of others. So these are the 2 considerations he's going to explore in chapter 10. The better to explain this, I would say, that I consider those capable of maintaining themselves alone, who can, through abundance of men or money, put together a sufficient army and hold the field against anyone who assails them. And I consider to have the need of others, so that's one way you do it alone, the need of others, those who cannot take the field against their enemies, but they're obliged to take refuge within their walls and stand on the defensive. We have already discussed the former case, and we'll speak of it in future as the occasion arises. But in the second case, there is nothing to be said except to encourage such a prince to provision and fortify his own town, and not to trouble about the surrounding country. So if you're going to depend on the protection of others, fortify your own town. And whoever has strongly fortified his town as regards to the government of his subjects has proceeded as we have already described and will further relate. You will be attacked with great reluctance if you're fortified. Pay attention, there's an arrow here. For men are always adverse to enterprises in which they foresee difficulties. It's too hard. I can't do it. It's too hard. So men are adverse to that. Now, at this point, I should remind you that this is being written in the Renaissance, and, we're not degrading women. We love women. But in those days, women didn't have the same quote-unquote station as men, unfortunately. So I'm not saying you have to accept that. I'm saying you have to understand that. And that when he says men here, you have to today always account for women. You and I are talking about men and women. Machiavelli's talking about men because it was a man's world in those days, right? No offense. You shouldn't take offense. Men are always adverse to enterprises in which they foresee difficulties, and it can never appear easy to attack one who has his town stoutly defended and isn't hated by the people. In other words, you're really not going to get far if the people love the prince and if you're going to lay siege to his town. Note the examples. The cities of Germany are absolutely free, and they have little surrounding country, and they obey the emperor when they choose, and they do not fear the emperor or any other potentate that they have about them. They are fortified in such a manner that everyone thinks that to reduce them, to attack them, would be tedious and difficult. For they have the necessary moats, bastions, sufficient artillery, and always keep food and drink and fuel for 1 year in public storehouses. Why didn't I mark that? Well, it's really not a saying. That's why I didn't mark it. I'm not going to mark it, ladies and gentlemen. But think about that they're so well prepared that they have food for a year. Beyond which, to keep the lower classes satisfied and without loss to the Commonwealth, they have always enough means to give them work for 1 year in these employments, which form the nerve and life of the town, and in the industries by which the lower classes live. Military exercise are still held in high reputation, and many regulations are in force for maintaining them. A prince, therefore, who possesses a strong city and does not make himself hated, cannot be assaulted. And if he were to be assaulted, the assailant would be obliged to retire shamefully. For so many things change that it is almost impossible for anyone to maintain a siege for a year with his armies idle. You can't just sit around waiting, right? Seizing a city for a year. That's what Machiavelli says. And those who urge the people having their possessions outside and seeing them burnt will not have the patience, and the long siege and self-interest will make them forget the prince. I reply that a powerful and courageous prince will always overcome those difficulties by now raising the hopes of his subjects that the evils will not last long, and now impressing them with fear of the enemy's cruelty, now by dexterously assuring himself with skill of those who appear to be bold. So he's going to say, don't worry, the enemy is going to be much more cruel than I am. Besides which, the enemy would naturally burn and ravage the country on first arriving, and at the time when men's minds are still hot and eager to defend themselves, and therefore the prince has still less to fear, for after some time when people have cooled down, the damage is done, and the evil has been suffered, and there is no remedy, so that they are more ready to unite with their prince, as it appears that he is under obligation to them, their houses having been burnt and their possessions ruined in his defense. So it's a win-win for the prince, right? When these people, if he were to be assaulted, in his city, and they burn everybody around them, eventually they cool down and they're gonna go back to the prince. It is the nature of men to be as much bound by benefits that they confer as by those that they receive. Pay attention. There's an arrow. From which it follows that, everything considered, a prudent prince will not find it difficult to uphold the courage of his subjects, both at the commencement and during the state of siege, if he possesses provisions and means to defend himself. Don't forget who he's writing this to. Chapter 11 of Ecclesiastical Principalities, Religious Principalities. Well, it now only remains of us to speak of ecclesiastical principalities, with regard to which the difficulties lie wholly before they are possessed. Difficulties in these types of principalities are before they are possessed. They are acquired by ability or by fortune. You acquire these ecclesiastical principalities by your ability, he's talking to Lorenzo the Magnificent, or by fortune, but they're maintained without either of these, for they are sustained by ancient religious customs. Catholic Church, which are so powerful and of such quality that they keep their princes in power in whatever manner they proceed and live. These princes alone have states without defending them. Think about that. He's telling you ecclesiastical principalities have states without defending them. They have subjects without governing them. Now I'm going to go back up here because there's a big footnote about Pope Alexander VI. You remember him. We've talked about him. His son was Caesar Borgia, right? He was a controversial pope in the Catholic Church. He reigned from 1492, you remember that, Christopher Columbus, to 1503. That's quite the reign, 11 years, right? And is often associated with what? Nepotism, corruption, political intrigue, and scandal. But it also coincided with cultural and political developments during the Italian Renaissance. He made his son a cardinal at a young age. Caesar Borgia later became a prominent military figure. We read about him in Machiavelli. His daughter, Lucretia Borgia, was married multiple times for strategic alliances, and she also became a symbol of scandals surrounding the Borgia family. All right. Without governing them and their states not being defended, they are not taken from them. Their subjects, not being governed, do not resent it, and neither think nor are capable of alienating themselves from them. And only these ecclesiastical principalities, therefore, are secure and happy. But as they are upheld by higher causes, right, which the human mind cannot attain to, the divine, God, religion, right? I'm going to, Machiavelli says, abstain from speaking of them. For being exalted and maintained by God, it would be the work of a presumptuous and foolish man to discuss them. But, however, I might be asked how it has come about that the church has reached such a great temporal power. Temporal meaning what? Non-religious, right? Temporal. When previous to Alexander VI, the Italian potentates, not merely the really powerful ones, but every lord or baron, however insignificant, held it in slight esteem as regards temporal power. Whereas now, it is dreaded by the King of France. What is dreaded? The temporal power of the Pope, right? For whom it has been able to drive out of Italy. And it also has been able to ruin the Venetians. And therefore, although this is well known, I do not think it's superfluous to call it to mind. Here's the example. So before Charles, King of France, came to Italy, this country was under the rule of the Pope, the Venetians, and the King of Naples. Aha! You remember how confused we were on the first few readings when he was talking about Italy? Now remember, who's he talking to? Lorenzo the Magnificent. What's he doing? Giving him advice. And he assumes, since he's talking to Lorenzo, he doesn't have to explain anything, in the first, he figures that Lorenzo understands what the hell he's talking about. Whereas we, reading this from the outside, we have to learn about these things in order to appreciate and understand what Machiavelli's saying. So in this little first few sentences here, we get a great picture of what we already read, and everything in your head should start falling into place. So before Charles came to Italy, this country was under the rule of the Pope, the Venetians, and the King of Naples, the Duke of Milan, and the Florentines. And these potentates had to have two chief cares. One, that no foreigner should enter Italy by force of arms, and the other, that none of the existing governments, plural, should extend its dominions. Those chiefly to be watched were the Pope and the Venetians. In other words, those were the dangers, right? And to keep back the Venetians required the alliance of all the others. And as in the defense of Ferrara and to keep the Pope down, they made use of the Roman barons. These were divided into two factions, the Orsini, you remember them, and the Colonna, you remember them. And as there was constant quarreling between them, and they were constantly under arms before the eyes of the Pope, they kept the papacy weak and infirm. And although there arose now and then a resolute pope like Sextus, yet his fortune or ability was never able to liberate him from these evils. So he was just there. The shortness of their life was the reason of this. For in the course of 10 years, which as a general a pope lived, he studies this stuff, right? He had great difficulty in suppressing even one of the factions. And if, for example, a pope had almost put down Colonna, a new pope would succeed who was hostile to the Orsini, which caused the Colonna to spring up again. And he was not in time to suppress them. You see, it's like you push one thing down. You see those games, you push one thing down, another pops up. Or in the case of the three-headed Hydra, you cut a head off and two more spring out. That's what Italy was like in these days. This caused the temporal power, not the religious power of the Pope, to be of little esteem in Italy. Who cares? But then arose Alexander VI, who of all the pontiffs who have ever reigned best showed how a pope might prevail both by money and by force. And with the Duke Valentine as his instrument, Duke Valentine is Caesar Borgia, right? And seizing the opportunity of the French invasion, he did all of that I have previously described in speaking of the actions of the Duke. Remember a couple readings ago? If you don't remember, go back and reread it. And although it'll make much more sense to you now that he's explaining all this. Well, Jimmy, why didn't you start with this reading instead of chapter? Well, we're reading the book as he wrote it for a reason. There's a reason why we do this and why it forces you. I was telling somebody the other day that one of the things, actually for my yearly physical, I was telling the doctor, said the problem with classical literature is that these days is they mostly dumb it down. They bring it down. They take it out of context and they bring it down so that they figure by doing that, well, everybody can understand it then. That's not the point of classical literature. The point of classical literature is for you to go to it, is for you to go to the classical literature and for you to understand what the heck is going on in those words. You. This is difficult because it's being translated, right? Luigi Ricci. And he's doing a damn good job. But we still have to go to the literature. Read the literature. Read the words. Don't dumb them down. That's a huge mistake with anything when you try to dumb it down. You understand? If not, you will. So, he did all that I have previously did. And although his object was to aggrandize not the church, but the Duke, what he did resulted in the aggrandizement of the church. He raised the level. He raised the level of the church temporal influence, which after the death of the Duke became the heir of his labors. Then came Pope Julius after Alexander, who found the church powerful, possessing all Romagna, all the Roman barons suppressed, and the factions destroyed by the severity of Alexander. So he also found the way open for accumulating wealth in ways never used before the time of Alexander. These measures were not only followed by Julius, but increased, and he resolved to gain Bologna, put down the Venetians, and drive the French from Italy. In all which enterprises he was successful. So Alexander VI laid the groundwork for Julius to do all this, and his merits he merits the greater praise, as he did everything to increase the power of the church, and not of any private person. I should mark that. Is that true? Oops, sorry. Pardon me. Let's do this. Is that true? Do you believe that? Question mark. Is that true? He also, we're going to discuss that in the analysis. He also kept the Orsini and Colonna parties in the condition in which he found them. And although there were some leaders among them who might have made changes, there were only two things that kept them steady. One, the greatness of the church. So Orsini and Colonna were powerful factions, principalities. The greatness of the church, which they dreaded. They dreaded the greatness of the church. Why? Because it's the church. It's not just temporal. And the other, the fact that they had no cardinals, who are the origin of the tumults among them, of the arguments among them. For these parties are never at rest when they have cardinals. For these parties, these city-states, right? For they stir up the parties, both within Rome and outside of Rome, and the barons are forced to defend them. See how complicated this is? It's like 3D chess, isn't it? Chess. Thus, from the ambitions of prelates arise the discords and tumults among the barons. His Holiness Pope Leo X, therefore, has found the pontificate in a very powerful position, from which it is hoped that, as those popes made it great by force of arms, so he, through his goodness and infinite other virtues, will make it great and venerated. We're going to save chapter 12 to the next reading. This was part 4. So, You've been reading with Jimmy. I want to call your attention to this note. We're on YouTube, ladies and gentlemen. We're on YouTube. Depending on when you came here, you either already knew that or you didn't know that. But as we develop our website and we gain in hours and hours and hours of classical literature reading, we decided to hop on YouTube where you can experience us as well as our website. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy. And you've been reading part 4 of Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, which is on this website. Hopefully you'll come back for part 5. I really appreciate you being here. I know time is not only relative, it's the only non-renewable resource you have, and the time you spend with me, I sincerely appreciate. So be sure to visit and read other classics on this website. We have many, A Novel in 9 Letters by Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Horla by Guy de Maupassant, all sorts of wonderful classical literature, because we need classical literature. Why? To understand how other people lead their lives and how to lead our own. And I know you must be, I hope you're gaining from Niccolo Machiavelli, because, ladies and gentlemen, his study of power is second to none. Remember, if you have questions, Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com, and there's my YouTube channel, right? And readingwithjimmy.com is the best way to get anything you want from me. Thanks for coming. Have a great day. And just keep reading, thinking,